has a cause for its existence. What a curious phrasing to say begins to exist. Do you have some example of something that doesn't begin to exist? And in what context do we mean begin to exist? Are we saying this particular pattern representation? Or are we saying these actual material components? Because there's not an atom in my body that just popped into existence on me. There are things I've taken in, breathing and eating, etc., that are adopted and complex chemicals. This is the process here. So what do we mean by begins to exist? And why was that word there? Well, or those words. I would say that the biggest reason those words are there is that earlier versions or earlier potential versions of this argument would say everything has a cause for its existence. And when they finally get around to concluding that God exists, now all of a sudden that means that God has a cause for its existence. But for some models of God, God is not a caused thing. That God is the uncaused cause, the first mover, the prime mover, the first cause. And so if you're going to argue for that, then you have to put in this particular language. Everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence.
Okay, what do you want to say here, Josh, on this little bit?
Mm-hmm. Essentially, what I kind of think is that it appears to me, as we've noted before, there's a few ways to kind of define or categorize a Kalam cosmological argument, and perhaps giving Matt the most charitable kind of explanation or understanding possible would be to kind of say that maybe he is only referring to Craig's formulation, and instead of viewing it as kind of how I view it, is in the entire group of kind of Islamic tradition arguing for the first cause, and perhaps that's why he's kind of nitpicking so strongly the wording of beginning to exist under his conception of it. And perhaps that's why he is very specific on this. But personally, I don't think it really matters whether you change this like wording of it or have different formulations or perhaps a different strengths, because I was thinking about something recently and I'm like, well, a lot of times, yes, the Kalam cosmological argument is presented as kind of a mainly deductive argument, one based on kind of like the logic. It's 100% like kind of you lead to a conclusion. It's 100% kind of certain in that kind of sense. But the same way, you may as well or just as easily have a probabilistic one to say, well, it's just more probable that the universe began to exist. It's just more probable that there is a cause, and therefore there is more probably, or it is most probably the case that the universe has a cause. And as a result, instead of having this kind of more of a 100% certainty, you have a more of a probabilistic understanding of it and just say, well, yeah, it is a really reasonable belief, even if you're not going to grant it. Say, well, maybe instead of being 100% certain that the universe began to exist, like 80% certain or 70% certain. So like there's a lot of different ways you could go around doing it, as long as you're saying, well, let's classify Kalam arguments as things which are not just the William Lane Craig traditional formulation. And I think it's just a bit more helpful, or at least to develop dialogue and discussion, to kind of take the second kind of discussion or viewing of the Kalam cosmological argument.
I think that's helpful. And I think like Matt would agree, like there isn't like the cosmological argument or the teleological argument. Like I've heard him say that a lot, which is like really good. And I think it'd be the same with the Kalam, where there's different ones with different PSRs and different ideas of what it means for the universe to begin to exist. And there are family of arguments, and we're just looking at just different ideas with like a similar core here. So I think that's helpful. And it actually kind of speculates a little bit with like why Kalam formulations have changed. But like even going back to like Al-Ghazali, there's people that would have a very similar argument to Craig. So it's not like there's been this massive historical shift in the past like 1,000 years.
Mm-hmm. I definitely agree with you on that.